I'm so excited to have you all here. Thank you for joining SOLA tonight for the Awardee Artists in Dialogue series, where our monthly community calls have transformed because we constantly want to recognize the SOLA awardees, and we thought, what better way to do it than to let them be seen and heard and talk about their process, their passion, the professionalism. There's so much we can gain and learn. And we are so thankful that Mary Coss is here with us tonight to help us learn and gain so much from what you do in the world. Welcome, Mary.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming.
So I also welcome Jenny Ruffner and Marge Levy, my leadership team cohort with SOLA. Welcome, ladies. Thank you for being here and for all that you do.
Wouldn't miss it.
Agreed. SOLA is located in Seattle, and we are and acknowledge that the lands we stand on are the traditional lands of the Squaxin, Nisqually, and all Coast Salish peoples. We recognize and honor the Duwamish people in particular, past and present, and the land itself here in Seattle. I encourage you to find out which tribal lands you might be thriving on these days. So, Mary, we are here to talk about your passion that drives your process.
Hi.
So there's a little bit going on in the world right now. Are you passionate about anything in particular that's happening?
I was hoping not to think about all of that.
Okay, we're not going to talk about it then. There's plenty that we can talk about, that we are prepared to talk about. I threw that out as a little curveball because, well, you know, we're in a room of talented thinkers and makers and creators that are all thinking about this. So I'm excited to hear from all of you in one way or another, but we're going to focus on what we plan to do today, Mary. Thank you. So Mary is located in Seattle. She is a mixed multimedia artist. We're going to learn a lot about her, and she's been a SOLA awardee since, is it 2018 or 19?
18.
18.
I think so.
Yeah. Early on, we said we got to bring this one in because we need more recognition, and we're so glad that you're here. I have had the honor of knowing you for a while. And what really fascinates me about your work is that you bring so much context to it. It looks like one thing, and there are so many layers, which I love, and I appreciate that about you. Can you tell me a little bit about what drives your work?
Yeah, I think when we were talking before, we were talking about the social justice aspect, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about where that comes from. Like so many of you, I came of age in the 60s, and I think that that was a really formative part of my art process. My father was a judge, and he was very political, and although our politics never meshed, he taught me to argue my point. and so over the years, when I went to college, I studied art and sociology, and the sociology studies were embedded in me. It's really a strong need to talk about storytelling in a way that shared injustices. And when I got out of college, I taught at an alternative high school for 5 years. And during that time, the students were very they weren't in the regular high school for a ton of reasons, but one thing that a lot of them had in common was that they were struggling in one way or another. And this friend of mine, Jean, who happens to be on this call, and I started a rape crisis center in answer to some of these students' needs. And so I have this long history of kind of responding to social justice issues.
Learning something new all the time. I love it. I didn't know that. Water is a very big part of your background and history. What is it that, how far back does this theme go for you?
Well, I grew up in Michigan, and besides witnessing the Detroit riots, we drove through Detroit during the fires, and we were actually on our way across town to go to the waterfront. I grew up spending a lot of time at the water. My parents had this funky little almost one-room cottage, and we used to go up to Lake Huron all the time. So the Great Lakes were part of my life when I was young. And there's a couple things about the water. I'm not sure why I've been so focused on it, but it's been a continual like focus of my interest for a long time. I've done a lot of art about the water, and the water and the trees are some of the very things that brought me to this area.
Now, aren't you doing a project right now? Your ancestors traveled along the waterways, I mean, exploring.
Yeah, so I got out a Google map and started tracing where my foremothers lived, and they were all along waterfronts, and they came from Scotland, Ireland, up the St. Lawrence Seaway to Detroit. And then I moved from Detroit to Seattle. So there's been this water theme that goes through many generations of my family. I lived in Southern California for a while. We used to drive down to the beach, and we would drive through the avocado fields on the way down there. I lived down there in the 80s. And then I went back 10 years later, and everything changed significantly. And then I went back 20 years later, and everything changed even more. Nicole asked me if I wanted to talk about passion or process. And I said, I want to talk about how passion drives process. And I decided that I would share this one body of work because it's quite large, and it shows you both my conceptual and my material approaches to things. This work is called Silent Salinity, and it started in I think it was 2018. The Museum of Northwest Art had a call out for artists to come to artist scientist speed dating, and and we basically shared what we're interested in, and then the artists and scientists got together and talked, and from that came work for this exhibit that was coming up. I was pitching water because I have this history of doing projects with water. I ended up working with Roger Fuller, who's here in this picture with me. And I was struck by the story that he told me about the estuaries. What he was it's 2016, I see here. So the thing that he was talking about was how as the saltwater encroaches on the estuaries and the fresh water recedes in the estuaries because of global warming, what's happening is this line where the estuary is keeps moving inland, and it's causing havoc in the estuaries. And the thing he was talking about was how there's salt where there was never salt before. And this is what initiated this idea or inspired me to call this series Silent Salinity. Part of my process is that I get visuals in my head that are like metaphors to tell stories. All I could see was like everything turning to salt. So I was thinking a lot about that. And so I started casting a bunch of objects in salt. So there's a bone and shell, and I was trying to like cast things that were from nature in the first round of this. And I started experimenting with how can I create something that looks like there's salt water dripping off of everything. And I do a lot of writing with wire, and I also write poems. And so this is a poem here on the left, and this is a detail shot of it. And I started experimenting with how can I make salt drip? And I tend to use a lot of materials that I just find around the house. And so I started experimenting with all sorts of things that I found in the garage, and also with trying to play around a little bit with syrups and things. in this first show, I had these objects, and then I also had these poems that I had written.
This is the whole image on the bottom left, is that right?
Yeah, so
That's the
it's about 40 inches tall and about 30 inches wide.
It says poetry. Is that a poem that you wrote? Or
It is a poem I wrote.
is the poem about salinity and the challenges that you are aware of now through this collaboration with Roger?
Yeah, so let me grab it and I'll read it to you. It's called Perfect Storm. Nightfall denies enfolding virgin waters. Tampered statistics drip. Melting rock turns to tears. Shadow sways life force to commodity, coagulated around greed. Forgive us our trespasses. Liquid life runs through clenched fingers, transforming fists held close. Oh, vulnerable fortune, seep into our conscience. Make your mark, change the tide.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Well, I was actually in this Mona show twice. So several years later, no, I was in it 3 times. So in 2018, they had another call. And so I actually ended up working with the same scientist again. And this time I asked him to write a journal entry as if he was sharing with a grandchild or telling somebody in the future, like a journal, what was going on in the estuaries. And he wrote this really poetic piece. And so I wrote the whole thing out on wire. And this is 10 feet wide and 8 feet tall. And it has the drippy, salty stuff on it. And it's now owned by the Padilla Bay Estuary. They have an interpretive center there and it's hanging there. So it's right near the estuaries.
Oh, wonderful. I've heard much about this estuary. You and both Ann Chadwick Reed also has worked there. So what about Ghost Meadow?
I hand tied with wire about, I think there was about 500 pieces of grass that this this bulrush is what is the it's kind of like ground zero for the estuaries. It's a green that the ducks eat, and there's a whole chain of flora and fauna that come off of this grass, and the grass is kind of the first sign of the estuary dying. So what happens is the grass itself gets barnacles on it. And then you know that the salt water has been there, and then the grass starts to die. And his writing, the thing that he wrote that I put in wire was actually a story about this grass. And so I also made this Ghost Meadow, which is it's wire dipped in abaca pulp and with in a kind of a bed of salt and sand.
Hmm. Is the installation of this, is this just one piece, or do you have to install this piece every single time with all the sand and abaca pulp and wire salt?
Yeah, it's a problem with working the way I work.
Uh-huh.
It's a storage nightmare, as all you sculptors out there know.
Yeah.
But yeah, the grass all is individual, and so I unpacked it and then repacked it. I've shown it a couple times.
Yeah. That I just imagine, if as I work on maybe small or even large boards, whatever the concept is, I am always thinking about that concept when I'm making this piece. So for you, with your passion for social justice and climate change, among many other things, what's happening how is it? Is it just enraging to process this every time, or is there kind of a catharsis that happens? A little bit of both.
Yeah, I guess there's it's hard to kind of think about like how I think that all of us struggle with thinking about the big picture, right? So we try to just like focus on a part of it. If you make it small, it's manageable, and then if you share that, hopefully there's a ripple that a conversation starts.
Yeah.
One thing that we talked about before was you were asking me about my grandchildren. I had these two little girls, and since they've been around, it just kind of drives us or pushes it even further, because there's this need to want them to be able to, you know, experience the same beautiful water and trees that I have when they get older. And so I think that in a funny way, it's more urgent now.
Mm-hmm. Is there
You can go to the
anything
next
about
slide.
the, okay, thank you.
This was another installation that I had at that show, which was called What Remains. And the idea was that there was like this, in some dystopian future, there is an excavation, and this is what they find. So I ended up kind of along with all my cast salt pieces, I also found a couple items like old film reels and an old typewriter that Holly shared with me that got redone to become part of this. So it's kind of a collection of things, and it's kind of like just like a ruins. You can go to the next slide.
It's really beautiful.
So
Here we go. Mhm.
I was
Yeah.
invited to do a show in Tacoma at in their storefronts program. They had a gallery for a while. And so this work developed as I went through the different shows. And this show was called After the Dig. And the idea was, okay, so there was this excavation, and now the stuff's been classified. And you can go to the next slide. And this is one of the items, this old telephone. So I made these classifications, and I made a stamp that says Silent Salinity. And so the whole room was just kind of full of these items that were all classified. So, and then I had a show at Method Gallery, and over the course of all this time, like probably for the last 10 years, I've been doing these studies, and they're all just like, I kept going to, I did a couple different residencies, and every time I would go to residency, I would just like focus on the water, and I was doing drawings and wire forms and working with ceramics. And so I had created all these tons of different studies. And so I decided to just put them all together on this wall. So this is a wall of the water studies that I did.
What wonderful diversity.
Thank you. And then what I also did at Method, I did a couple things there. I did an installation that kind of was strewn along one wall, and it was a remix of like my Ghost Meadow and a bunch of wire poetry that I'd written. And so I just kind of took all the stuff and reworked it all and created this other kind of installation.
Haunting is a word that I have seen alongside your work, written about your work, and it really does have that haunting quality to it.
So the other thing that I did at Method was I actually used the gallery as a place to do this big installation, and this was like the last of the series of exhibits that I did. And so what I wanted to do there is say like the first Thursday, this blue cloud of water was not there. So it was just this other work in the gallery. And then between the two first Thursdays, I worked in the gallery and created this tidal wave, and it was called Groundswell. And the idea is that whatever happens, nature is still going to win eventually. And, you know, like we mess around with nature as much as we want, but it will be here, and it might change some, but it will still be here. So I wanted to use that as a metaphor of this big wave that was coming in the room. And it looked, I think I have do I have an image of it from outside? because when you look through these windows, oh, I
Mhm.
didn't. When you look through the windows, all the front of by the windows is the crest of the wave, and it's made with lots of written wire that holds the front of it. And so anyways, the next slide is the same wave from a different angle. So that was walking under it. And this is at Bainbridge at BEMA. And when it was there, one of the things that I think is interesting about I use a lot of cursive. Well, all my wire work is in cursive. And when I first started writing with this wire, it was when I was working on these projects. And I was thinking about how written script is also endangered. And when I
Mhm.
had this piece up at Bainbridge, it was so interesting because a group of kids came through there. I think they were third graders, and there was only two children in the class that could read the writing. And it looked like hieroglyphics to the rest of them. And so those two kids were having a lot of fun reading the text to the rest of the students.
That it talks about a whole nother component of the things that we are experiencing as everything transforms, thinking about your travels and the 80s to this avocado farm that was rich and beautiful and abundant, and then traveling there 20 years later and seeing all of the challenges and thinking about your granddaughters and the experiences that they will never have again, and that you are creating these pieces with these experiences to share with not only them but with others, so that we can try and either make change or adapt. Exciting.
So creating change and adapting. So Tommy Gregory, a friend of mine, set up a pop-up gallery space in Columbia City in 2021. And it was just an empty building. And he wanted me to do an installation. And I had always wanted to just do this whole wave without the fabric on it because the frame itself was really gorgeous. And so I installed it there, just the frame, and it was much more of like an abstract piece. And I also really salted up all the wire so that it became this real, I mean, I think when I'm working, I think of, I use a lot of metal rod in addition to wire, and I think of it as drawing in space. And so it was fun to be able just to get the armature out there by itself and have it like occupy the room.
It's really beautiful by itself. So when you say you salted the wire, can you break that down for us a little bit? What does that mean?
Yeah, well, for this installation, all I did was I dripped white paint and salt all over everything.
Okay,
And there was some big chunks of salt too, but
beautiful. And so this is titled Elusive Structures, is that right?
that was the name of the show.
Oh, thank you. Mhm. Oh, this is, I think, what we
Oh,
were talking about before.
okay, so you are able to see this is the wave in so many different ways. So this was the other form of this wave, and this was looking into the gallery outside of Method.
And so this is the armature that you were talking about that was in the previous slide that had
Yeah,
been painted white and salted.
yeah.
Yeah. And is the text of this a poem or a scientist's notes or a little bit of everything?
It's a little bit of everything. And so this is looking at that straight on again. So you can see the different reincarnations of this wave. And I think we did put maybe one in of the whole structure. Let's see the next slide. Right, so this is the armature in that pop-up show. And in the background there's a piece also it's the piece that's on the flyer for this, and it's the typewriter with on this pile of salt with text coming out of it, flying out of it. And it has waves being projected on it. So it actually is the next slide, is it a close-up? Yeah. So the waves kind of created this interesting eerie thing because it really did feel like this little island all by itself, but of course it's backwards because it has waves on the land, which yeah.
So this blue that we're seeing this is a projection of waves that is
Yeah.
on the pile of salt.
Yeah.
And text with the typewriter that has all been painted and salted or.
Yeah, and I often use lighting, sound, projection, different things to I'm really interested in trying to create like a visceral experience for people. And so I find that when I integrate those other media, that's a way to kind of push that. Well, I was in residence at Bellevue last year, and they had a sustainability grant that I applied for, and I got it. And with that grant, myself and a couple other artists created discussion groups with the scientists at the school and some students, and we ended up trying to put together, well, we put together work that talked about social justice in relation to climate. And I also applied to Mona at the same time because they were having the Surge show again. And I got in that show. So I kind of like put both of these projects together, and I kind of crowdsourced my scientists. I ended up working with several scientists, and the lead scientist at Bellevue thought that I should work with a psychologist. So I did that also. So it was really interesting having like the scientists and the psychologists, all in, like the geologists, all in one room together. And we had these really interesting discussions. And this piece ended up, so a witness tree is a tree that has witnessed historic events. And so I created a witness tree for the Skagit Valley. And the Skagit Valley is the first place that's going to flood in the Northwest. And, parts of it are already under sea level, and there's dikes that keep it from flooding. So I decided to, since the show started at Mona, I decided to actually look into the history of the Skagit. And I did a timeline. So this witness tree lived in the Skagit as a seedling. It started in 1820 and it lived through 1860 and lived through 2060. And so this is a witness tree with 200 years. The top of it has 200 rings, and those rings change, either they're thin or they're thick, depending on what the stressors of that year were. And so what I did was I put together kind of a 200-year history of what went on in the Skagit. And a lot of it is about the people of the Skagit and how, for instance, in 1863, I think it was, the first settlers arrived in the Skagit, and within 2 years, they had driven all the indigenous community into small areas of in the area, into a couple islands and small areas. And then there were several things that happened in the area. In Bellingham, there were a lot of East Indians that were run out during the 20s, and the Chinese were run out in the 1880s. So there's like this history of colonialism that I was tracking both in the rings and in the bark. And so the bark is everything that I wrote on the timeline is written and put into the bark.
This is so
I think I said
beautiful.
everything.
Yeah. I mean, I started the conversation with how impressive your work is, that you look at something and you just have no idea the impact that you are conveying So it's so great to understand more about what this piece is really saying. And what size is this? And the material?
Oh, you'll see in the next slide.
Okay, good. Here we are. There we are.
It's almost 5 feet tall, and you can see on the left over there on the wall, that's the timeline. So I included the timeline for people to read, because one thing I found is that I like that the wire work is abstracted and it's hard to read my wire writing. I mean, especially when I start layering it. When I do a lot of layers like I did with the bark, there's like 3 layers in a lot of the places on the bark. It becomes nearly impossible to read, but I also felt like this history was important, so I put it on the wall too.
Beautiful.
Silent Salinity explores the relationship between water, global warming, and culture. I do this for my grandchildren and humanity, and because I have to. All the artists out there know what I mean when I say because I have to.
Yeah.
So this is the next work that I'm working on, and it's kind of a combination of several different things. So it has to do with my foremothers. It has to do with searching for my own migration path, and I'm creating this kind of haunting installation that mixes imagery. For instance, there's quite a few bones in there, and there's an egg image, and there's a kind of a abstracted boat on the floor. And I've cast a couple suitcases in really I cast them kind of in lace, and so they look like they're degrading, like they're hundreds of years old. And the show is called Too Much to Carry, and it's going to be at Vestibule in September. And it's really exciting because it's going to be, I'm working with another artist. It's a 2-person show, and Mana Mehebrian lives in Spokane, and she's an Iranian artist who is much, much younger than me, and she has immigrated in the past 10 years. And so we're both approaching this story about with personal and cultural references, and we're both working from common imagery, but they're manifesting in very, very different ways. So there's like these parallel stories that are same but different.
We'll just give a second to read it for everybody. If you've been absorbed in the images, just take a second to read what Too Much to Carry is about. You know, Mary, we have seen your work. We understand a little bit about the process, but the one thing I think we can't see here is the work that you do. Well, we talked a little bit about the collaborations, but you work so much in community and the collaborations. Is there something more that you want to share with us about community and collaboration, or what does that mean to you to work into community?
Well, I would say that I do a ton of research for all of my projects, and part of my research is talking with people and interviewing people. And it's probably, I mean, I do it in my studio work, but it really drives my public work, because of course, like other public artists, we're always responding to the demographics of the site and that kind of thing. And looking at the history of the site to make it relevant to the normal, the average person that comes by and runs into that, wants to know what it's about. But I think that I find it really interesting. I'm driven by people's stories. And so collaborating with scientists or interviewing a stakeholder in a public project, whatever it is, it's always, to me, really interesting to try to like take things that people come up with and incorporate their stories and incorporate them in some way. And I really try to like work the metaphors and not, I think my goal as an artist is to ask questions. And so even though I'm using common imagery, I'm using it as a way to pose a question. So I don't think of my stuff as still life or anything like that, even though I'm using objects from everyday life. I think of it as presenting what you're familiar with as a window for you and doing some kind of a twist on it so that it makes you wonder, like, why would she do that? Or so either it gets made out of a material that it wouldn't normally be made out of, or it's morphed into something else, or it's abstracted as a suggestion.
Or you're using, how did you phrase it? Lines in space. Your
Lines in space, yeah.
lines in space, your abstraction of space itself with the text that you're writing right there. It's really beautiful. Is there a story, a particular one that comes to mind of someone that you've worked? This is totally off the cuff, so we're not prepared to talk about this, but I'm inspired to ask.
Okay.
Is there someone that you have collaborated with or worked with, be it a scientist, the psychologist? That's probably the first time someone's recommended you work with a psychologist that wasn't offensive, but but is there a story? Maybe it was a student. I think, you have so much that you've given back to society in your community work. And I just love to give the audience one bit of that, something that comes to mind that you'd like to share.
Um,
Anything.
well, I guess I could say that, I kind of go down these rabbit holes, right? And so I think of doing one thing and then I have to like search out somebody to find out about that. And I think a lot of you have probably, if you know my work at all, you've probably seen my ghost log because it's probably the thing that I'm most known for. But that was really a collaborative community project. And I ended up doing so many interviews that it rolled into a podcast and it rolled into a sound piece. And I interviewed workers that worked at this mill that burnt down. And I interviewed, I talked with several people from the Puyallup tribe that from the history department, and I ended up interviewing a historian. And then the two stories that I was told by the two historians, one from the tribe and one not, were so different that
Oh.
I had to do the podcast because it was like, oh my God, I have to share this. This is crazy. So I kind of put them back to back. So you're like, whoa, that's different. But I think that I'm just really intrigued by stories and I was able to work with the language department with the tribe because I was doing words. I actually put words in that piece too, because I kind of put text in everything these days, it seems like. So I was working with the language department with the tribe. So it's I don't know. There's a lot of people that I have to thank for my projects. A lot of different people involved in different ways.
Yeah, well, we thank you for including all of those people. It's complicated enough to take a poem and make it into a handwritten line out of wire. You just exponentially add on so that we have this repository of information in addition to the beauty and the aesthetic of Mary Coss. It's quite a beautiful experience that you're sharing today.
Thanks.
You're so welcome. I want to just check the chat and see if there's any questions. You're welcome to put anything over there for everybody in the audience. Janice Baker says, with a message of social justice or the environment, has it been hard to get shows? I live in a red area and opportunities seem to favor more conservative art. Thank you for that question, Janice. Mary, you got any advice or suggestions for her?
Well, I think it's kind of the opposite in Seattle that people like to show kind of hot button topics in some ways, but it is hard to find places to show when you're not doing commercial work. And all of you out there that do installations understand that. So I'd say that's been more of a struggle for me than the other.
Do you find the collaborations are beneficial for finding shows, or are you just working with the ideas from these collaborators?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that, but what it makes me think of is that like I do some curating too, and I just curated a show with several artists over at Bellevue College, and it was called Fibonacci Footprint, and it was people that are working with issues of global warming. And I think that the interesting thing about the more people that are involved in a show, the more people that hear about it, that see it, so I mean, in that way, I think that the more people that you work with, the bigger your footprint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you for that. Kathy Gorfuss made a comment here. Mary's work is so beautiful. It makes you think about aspects of our individual lives crossing over others and how we could make a difference in the future of each one of our own ecologies. Thank you for that. That's beautiful.
I'm interested in the existential questions, and that's what, drives me. So it's nice to hear Kathy say that. Thank you, Kathy.
Kathy's doing her own really important work about the environment. In fact, I see several faces on this call that are significant in this conversation. So thank you all. If there are any other questions, feel free to put them in. So Mary, this is your opportunity. Tell us where we can find out more about you and what you're up to.
I've gotten really bad about social media, but I am on Instagram. I do try to keep my website updated. So that's probably a good place, but yeah, I have to get to work on that Instagram page of mine.
What is, and your website is marycoss.com?
Yes.
That's MARYCOSS.com.
No R. Don't cross the class.
You
I say
had
that
to
because
mention it.
it happens so much.
It's just Coss. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Any final words or advice, suggestions for our lovely audience today?
Where's Melpina? She always has a question.
All right. I am so grateful for you, for the work that you have done. I know that in the future, your granddaughters will look back on what it is that you have created both for your family and for them. In fact, I'm speaking to all of the women on this call and in the future that are doing your work, archiving your work, so that individuals in the future can know these poignant messages, even if it's a message of beauty and peace. There's so much that we are sharing in these moments, and it's really important. So, Mary, thank you for leading us in this conversation so that we can think to the future as we create in the now. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody, for taking your time today. I know that we're all busy, so I really appreciate it.
It was a really fun time for me. Thank you all. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right. We will see you again next time, hopefully. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye for now.
Bye.